Today we'll explore how a humble grain distillate became Scotland's premier national symbol, recognizable around the world. It's hard to find another drink whose destiny is so inextricably intertwined with the history and identity of an entire country. Today, Scotch single malt whiskey is a benchmark of quality, a collector's item, and an integral part of Scotland's image in the eyes of the world. However, its path to this status was long, dramatic, and full of paradoxes. It began not in the gleaming copper stills of modern distilleries, but in primitive alembics on remote farms, where a harsh climate and poverty forced farmers to seek ways to preserve their barley harvests. How did this water of life, from the Gaelic whisky travel the path from illegal distillate, subject to exorbitant taxes, to a national treasure whose exports generate billions? The emergence of whiskey as an icon is the story of how geographical necessity, political twists and turns, technological innovation, and ingenious marketing created one of the most powerful brands in the world. This is the story of how Scotland managed to appropriate and perfect the art of distillation, turning its water of life into a legend recognized on every continent. Surprisingly, the fate of whiskey as a future national symbol was predetermined by three simple yet harsh factors: poor soil, poor weather, and a shortage of firewood. It so happened that geographical and economic limitations became not an obstacle, but a major creative catalyst. Scotland's climate, especially in the highlands and island regions, is ill-suited to agriculture. Short, cool summers and long, wet winters presented farmers with the question how to transform a meager harvest into something storable, marketable, or barterable. The answer was barley, one of the few grains that can withstand such conditions. However, the grain spoiled. Distillation proved a brilliant solution, allowing not only to preserve but also to concentrate the harvest's nutritional value, turning it into a stable, transportable, and highly valuable product. Thus, practical necessity gave birth to a tradition. The second pillar was water, not just water in quantity, but water of a special quality. Numerous streams and rivers, originating in peat bogs and granite cliffs, were exceptionally soft, free of iron, and rich in natural minerals. This water was the ideal medium for fermentation, as it did not hinder the yeast or introduce off flavors. Moreover, each valley had its own unique water profile, laying the foundation for the future diversity of flavors. Water was not just an ingredient, it was the soul of a place, its terroir, which cannot be replicated outside of a specific location. The third and most characteristic element is peat. In the treeless highlands and islands, there was no resource for heating or drying. Local residents learned to cut layers of peat, a dense layer of moss, heather, and organic matter compressed over millennia. Peat burned with a long, fragrant, and smoky flame. It was used to heat homes, but most importantly, it was used to dry sprouted barley, malt, halting the germination process. Unlike smokeless charcoal, peat smoke deeply penetrated each grain, imbuing it with phenols. These compounds later, during distillation and aging, developed into the famous aromas of campfire, iodine, tar, seawater, and heather. Thus, the lack of resources gave birth to the most recognizable organoleptic characteristic of Scotch whiskey, which became its calling card and the subject of mystification. But raw materials alone weren't enough. A technological process adapted to local conditions became crucial. The first distillations were conducted in small monasteries, which were dissolved after the Reformation, and their knowledge dissipated among the people. Simple alembics, copper stills for direct distillation, began to appear on farms. Their design was simple and functional, but it also concealed another secret. The shape of the Scottish still, often with small, narrow necks and characteristic swan necks, facilitated more intensive vapor rectification, producing a purer and more aromatic spirit than other types of stills. Copper, from which stills were traditionally made, acted as a natural catalyst, binding and removing unwanted sulfur compounds. This copper conversation between metal and spirit is still considered magical, impossible to fully replicate in steel stills. Thus, by the 17th century, a unique ecosystem had emerged. Barley from local fields, dried over the smoke of local peat, distilled with pure local water in locally constructed copper stills. The product of this ecosystem was deeply local, place-bound. It was not uniform. Whiskey from the Hebrides was radically different from that from Speyside. But it was precisely this initial, almost pristine variability, born of geography and necessity, that became the very wealth that would later be packaged into the beautiful legend of a national symbol. At this stage, whiskey was a national treasure, a homecraft, a means of survival. It was not yet Scotch whiskey in the modern branded sense. It was whiskey from a specific Scottish valley or island. The transformation of this collection of local practices into a single powerful national myth was facilitated paradoxically by an external force, the strict fiscal policy of the English crown. The path from homecraft to national treasure lay through an era of confrontation with the state, which became the unwitting co-author of the legend. The 18th century marked a turning point. After union with England in 1707 and defeat in the Jacobite uprisings, London began actively restoring order and replenishing the treasury in the north. In 1725, an exorbitant tax on malt was introduced, which not only imposed a duty on production but also outlawed the very foundation of Scottish craft. This triggered a golden age of illegal distilling that lasted nearly a century and a half. Smugglers and clandestine distillers became folk heroes, and their confrontations with royal tax collectors, gaugers, became part of folklore. Whiskey from legal, tax-free distilleries was derisively called patent. Light or highland whiskey produced clandestinely was considered genuine. This era shaped the key traits of the future symbol: a spirit of rebellion, resilience in the face of authority, and the romance of secret knowledge. Distillers perfected the art of secrecy. They located distilleries in inaccessible gorges, employed night distillations, and invented signaling systems. Technology also evolved. To quickly conceal their tracks, whiskey began to be transported in charred sherry and port casks, accidentally discovering the beneficial effects of oak aging on the taste and color of the drink. The situation changed dramatically in 1823 with the passage of the Excise Act, which legalized distillation subject to the payment of a reasonable fee and the receipt of a license. This law, initiated by a Scotsman, was not an act of generosity but a pragmatic solution to fill the treasury rather than waste resources on an endless war against smugglers. Many underground distilleries became legal, and it was from this point that the emergence of major commercial brands began. Figures like George Smith, the founder of Glenlivet, a former smuggler turned legitimate distiller and a benchmark for quality, embodied this transition. His famous remark about carrying a pair of pistols to protect himself from former colleagues, dissatisfied with his legalization, only underscores the urgency of the moment. At the same time, the technological revolution gave whiskey two key tools for its global future. First, the coffee still, a continuous distillation column invented in 1830, allowed for the rapid and inexpensive production of large volumes of pure grain spirit. This led to the emergence of blended whiskey, where neutral grain spirit was mixed with aromatic single malt distillates to create a stable, smooth, and affordable product. Second, it was in the 19th century that the practice of mandatory oak cask maturation was finally established, transforming whiskey from a crude distillate into a refined, complex spirit. By the end of the 19th century, Scotch whiskey, especially blended brands like Johnnie Walker, Chivas Regal, and Teachers, had gained worldwide popularity. However, tragedy ensured the symbol's true triumph: the phylloxera plague that devastated French vineyards in the 1880s. The global market lost the primary distillate for cognac production. Scotch whiskey, with its similar status as an aged noble spirit, instantly filled the vacant niche, becoming a must-have in the clubs and salons of the Victorian British Empire and beyond. From a drink of the Scottish Highlands, it became a drink of British gentlemen, and thus a global phenomenon. Thus, politics, technology, and historical accident converged to elevate a humble grain distillate to an international pedestal. By the early 20th century, Scotch whiskey was already a successful export product, but it had yet to fully crystallize as a national symbol. This process was not as spontaneous but carefully orchestrated, and two driving forces, law and marketing, merged to create an impenetrable legend. The first and fundamental step was strict legal protection of identity. In 1909, a royal commission established a legal definition of Scotch whiskey, distinguishing it from other distillates, but the culmination of this process was the Scotch Whisky Act 1988 and subsequent EU legislation. They clearly and unambiguously stipulated that whiskey could only be called Scotch if it was distilled and matured in Scotland, aged in oak casks for at least 3 years, and had an ABV of at least 40% upon bottling. This was a brilliant move, transforming the geographical indication into a protected global category like champagne or Parma ham. The word Scotch became a brand protected by law worldwide, and Scotland became its unique source. This legal formalization became more than just a formality, but a framework agreement with the consumer, guaranteeing authenticity, quality, and origin, eliminating counterfeiting and allowing for the creation of a unified, trustworthy product image. A second, no less important force was the massive myth-making that unfolded in the mid and second half of the 20th century. Marketers at major distilleries took disparate real-life stories about smugglers, family traditions, the influence of local water and climate, and wove them into a cohesive, compelling, and easily marketable tale. The emphasis in advertising and promotion shifted from affordable blended whiskey, which accounted for the lion's share of the market, to single malt whiskey. Single malt became the protagonist of this new narrative, an ideal product for mythologization. Each distillery began to be presented as a unique character, born of its specific location and inimitable conditions. Water from a local source began to be described not just as an ingredient, but as the lifeblood of whiskey, carrying the secret of its purity. Peat smoke from the islands of Islay and Islay became the breath of ancient lands, linking the drink to prehistoric landscapes. The sea air permeating the casks in coastal warehouses was romanticized as the soul of the ocean, imparting a touch of the Atlantic's stormy spirit to whiskey. Even the shape of the copper still and the craftsmanship of the distillers became part of a secret art passed down from generation to generation. This was a brilliant terroirization of the product, borrowed from winemakers but applied on an even grander scale. Consumers were being sold not just alcohol, but an entire journey and a sense of belonging to a mystery. A sip of Speyside whiskey is the fruity honey and heather of rolling hills. A sip of Islay is the meditative smoke and iodine notes of a rugged island. Luxurious gift packaging, literature with tasting notes, the creation of associations with high art and an aristocratic lifestyle, all this worked to create an image of whiskey as a product for thoughtful, almost intellectual consumption, a luxury item and a cultural code for the initiated. Globalization and the new renaissance that began at the turn of the 21st century only reinforced this status. Whiskey transcended the confines of a drink and became a fully fledged collectible and alternative investment. Limited releases, bottles at auction fetching hundreds of thousands of dollars, and cult distilleries like Ardbeg or Macallan producing one-offs, all of this elevated the perception of whiskey to the level of fine art. Pop culture has reinforced and replicated this image, from classic detective films, where a tired inspector drinks good old Scotch as a reward for a hard day, to modern complex television series, where a glass of single malt is an essential attribute of a reflective, profound character. Today, whiskey has long been more than just a drink. It's an economic pillar of Scotland, providing tens of thousands of jobs and generating billions in export revenues comparable to the financial sector. It's a key element of tourism. The Malta-tour and distillery visitor centers, transformed into modern temples with interactive tours and tasting rooms, annually welcome millions of pilgrims from around the world seeking to connect with the source of the myth. It's a living, breathing symbol that manages to be both conservatively traditional and boldly innovative. Alongside staunch classic methods, bold experiments are emerging with aging in the most unexpected casks, from sherry and bourbon to wine, port, and even rum, with varying degrees of peatiness and signature blends that blur regional boundaries. Thus, Scotch whiskey became a universal symbol not because it had always been so, but because of a unique confluence of circumstances, the strategic transformation of historical necessity into cultural virtue, ironclad legal protection, and myth-making of unprecedented scale and effectiveness. It embodied key Scottish paradoxes, a rebellious spirit and a profound respect for the law, the harshness of the climate and the refined complexity of flavor, deeply local roots, and a truly global appeal. Ultimately, it is the story of Scotland, complex, aged, and refined by craftsmanship, bottled. It would seem that by the beginning of the 21st century, whiskey had reached the peak of its symbolic power. However, behind the shiny facade of a global brand lay vulnerability, and the new century immediately presented it with serious challenges, testing the very foundations of its legend. The first blow came in the form of cyclical crises of overproduction and subsequent shortages. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, after the boom, Many distilleries were mothballed or demolished, like the famous Port Ellen, as stocks of mature spirits significantly exceeded demand. But when demand, particularly from emerging Asian markets, skyrocketed in the 2010s, the industry faced the opposite problem: a shortage of older, matured stock. This led to a sharp rise in the prices of aged whiskeys, the disappearance of beloved lines from shelves, and a wave of discontent among loyal fans who felt their traditional drink was becoming increasingly elitist and alienating. The second, more profound challenge was changing consumer trends. The global trend toward a healthier lifestyle, declining alcohol consumption, and the growing popularity of competing distillates like craft gin and premium rum forced the industry to seek new paths. The response was an unprecedented surge in innovation. Distilleries, which for centuries had espoused the immutability of tradition, began bold experiments. Unconventional whiskeys appeared on the market, in casks previously used for Amontillado sherry, port, southern wine, and even rum and tequila. The process of finishing, fermentation in a different cask, became common practice. Whiskeys smoked on various types of peat or even seaweed. White, unaged whiskeys that showcased the pure flavor of the spirit, and countless signature blends appeared. This other side of the industry demonstrated that the symbol is capable of adaptation and dialogue with modernity without losing its essence. The third front is ecology and social responsibility. Climate change, rising temperatures, and shifting seasons is already impacting the quality of barley and the temperature of the masonry, which could alter the familiar flavor profile over time. In response, most major houses have launched large-scale carbon reduction programs, switching to biomass and green energy for heating, implementing closed-loop water management, and seeking local sources of barley. Sustainability has ceased to be a buzzword, becoming a matter of long-term survival for an icon whose strength has always been rooted in Scotland's natural environment. Finally, the fourth challenge is digitalization and the struggle to appeal to a new generation. Whiskey, as a classic brand, risks being associated with the world of old. To counter this, the industry is actively embracing social media, creating immersive digital distillery tours, and releasing limited editions in collaboration with artists and musicians. The emphasis is shifting to authenticity, craftsmanship, and provenance, values important to millennials and Generation Z. Whiskey is learning to tell its story in a new language. Thus, in the 21st century, Scotch whiskey as a symbol is being tested for its resilience. It faces economic cycles, changing tastes, environmental threats, and digital transformation. But its response is not to stagnate in the past, but to evolve dynamically. It uses crises as opportunities for creative reinvention, balancing the sacred preservation of tradition with bold experimentation. This ability to adapt without betraying its essence is perhaps the most compelling proof of its strength. A symbol that can change while remaining true to itself is no longer just an image from the past, but a living, breathing organism confidently facing the future. The journey of whiskey from a simple farmhouse distillate to an enduring symbol of Scotland is a story of alchemy, where the raw material of economic necessity and harsh natural conditions was transformed into the pure gold of cultural myth. Whiskey became more than a drink. It evolved into a capacious and recognizable code, encoded with the very identity of the nation. This code is read in the aroma of peat smoke, reminiscent of ancient, untouched landscapes, in the strict legal framework protecting the name Scotch worldwide, a testament to Scottish pragmatism and respect for the rules, and in the endless diversity of flavors, reflecting the character of each individual region, from the moorland plains of the lowlands to the stormy shores of Islay. But most importantly, this symbol is alive. It is not frozen in the past, like a museum exhibit. It is evolving, experimenting with new aging methods, mastering digital markets, and continuing to attract new generations of connoisseurs around the world. Whiskey remains a powerful economic driver and cultural magnet for Scotland, drawing travelers eager to see the birthplace of legend with their own eyes. Thus, whiskey has fulfilled a rare mission. It not only represents Scotland to the world, but has become one of the main reasons the world looks with such interest to this small but incredibly historically rich country. Each bottle contains not just living water, but the very soul of Scotland, persistent, complex, time-honored, and open to dialogue.